I keep hearing people say that Phase 4 of the MCU was a failure. A complete disaster, an embarrassment, a catastrophe, nobody's showing up to see these movies, Marvel went woke and got broke, and every movie just keeps flopping. Now, on an artistic level, there is a discussion to be had about the quality of the projects released. I mean, I didn't like this phase and thought it was easily the weakest one so far, so let's get that out of the way. I think Phase 4 sucked. Easily the worst phase yet. But it doesn't matter what I personally think. Was it really a failure in the grand scheme of things? Was there really that big of a dip in quality from Iron Man to Love and Thunder? Well, I did some digging into how much money every single MCU movie has made and looked at the fan reception of each one so that I can give you a concrete answer to this question. Was Phase 4 of the MCU a failure? And I'm just talking movies. It's too complicated to calculate how many people really watched an episode of a television show, especially how long they watched it, what constitutes a full view, how that view translates to money. It's hard to be accurate on these things. So I'm just comparing movies versus movies. If you came here to hear a deep dive on the atrocity that is She-Hulk or the inconsistencies of Hawkeye, I'm sorry. There's plenty of that out there already. I personally think this was a huge failed experiment. I mean, the TV shows were either poorly written, really bad, boring, rushed, mediocre, insanely stupid, or vigorously inconsistent. But if I bring them up anytime in this video, that'll just be my opinion. There are many ways to quantify a cinematic success or failure, whether it's reviews, box office, digital sales, merch sales, your personal opinion on the writing, directing, editing, storytelling consistency, many ways. But the only factual, objective aspects I can look at are box office and critical consensus. These are the two elements that people are claiming Marvel has consistently been failing at over the past 3 years. The narrative has been, nobody's going to see these movies, and nobody likes them. So, let's break it down to see if this is true. Starting with box office. Phase 1 had 6 movies. Iron Man, which made $585 million. The Incredible Hulk, making $265 million. Iron Man 2, which made $624 million. Thor, making $449 million. Captain America the First Avenger, making $370 million. And The Avengers, which made a whopping $1.52 billion. Some of these numbers aren't what we're used to for an MCU movie, but we have to remember that they were just starting out back then, and this was a huge gamble. They were laying the groundwork for what a connected universe could look like, and every movie wasn't a sure hit just yet. Phase 1 made a total of $3.813 billion. Next is Phase 2, also consisting of 6 movies. Iron Man 3 making $1.215 billion, Thor the Dark World making $645 million, The Winter Soldier making $714 million, Guardians of the Galaxy, which made $773 million, Age of Ultron, which made $1.405 billion, and Ant-Man, hauling in $519 million. Marvel was starting to hit their stride at this point, and Phase 2 brought in a total of $5.27 billion. Then we have Phase 3, consisting of 11 movies. Civil War racking in $1.153 billion, Guardians 2 with $864 million, Spider-Man Homecoming with $880 million, Thor Ragnarok with $854 million, Black Panther with $1.347 billion, Infinity War making $2.05 billion, Ant-Man and the Wasp with $622.7 million, Captain Marvel with $1.128 billion, Endgame with an astounding $2.798 billion, and Spider-Man Far From Home ending it with $1.131 billion. Easy to say, this was the most successful phase from a monetary point of view, and this is when Marvel set the expectations for every film to almost hit $1 billion. I mean, 6 out of the 11 films hit $1 billion. Damn! Phase 3 made a total of $13.504 billion. Now, Phase 4 consisted of 7 movies. Black Widow made $380 million in theaters and an estimated $125 million from its Disney Plus same-day release, totaling $505 million. Shang-Chi hauled in $432 million. Eternals made $402 million. Spider-Man No Way Home brought in $1.91 billion. Multiverse of Madness made $955 million. Thor Love and Thunder made $760 million, and Wakanda Forever made about $859 million, coming out to a total of $5.825 billion. So, as you can see here, Marvel hasn't really missed a beat when it comes to the financial side of their films. With only one more movie, Phase 4 made $600 million more than Phase 2, and $2 billion more than Phase 1. Yes, we can't just look at these numbers in isolation and say, look, Phase 4 is just as good as Phase 1 and 2. One could argue that when these movies came out directly correlates with how well they performed, and the MCU has become an unstoppable juggernaut at this point. So of course the movies are gonna make more money. We have to accept that there is a heavy section of fans who will eat up anything Marvel gives them without blinking an eye. So $400–500 million is an absolute guarantee these days, when that wasn't the case back in 2010 and 2011. Casting Chris Evans as Cap and this unknown Australian guy as Thor were huge gambles back then, but now they literally print money. And these newer projects will continue to gain interest as long as you keep them slightly connected to these characters we fell in love with. But let's forget these numbers for a second and look at something even more important. I took the total amount of money each phase made and divided it by how many movies there were to see the average amount of money each one made. I think this gives us a better idea of the consistency of each phase, because nobody is as good as their best moment or as bad as their worst moment. Life is defined by averages, and it's hard to compare different phases of movies when they don't have the same amount of films. So, as you see, Phase 4 was the third most profitable one, with an average box office of $832,143,000 per movie. And a lot of that success was built on the back of this nostalgia bomb, and this guy's death. But if we actually want to look at quote-unquote profit, let's look at each phase's estimated return on investment, which might be the most important factor in determining business success or failure. Nobody ever knows the exact budget of any of these movies, and you can't find concrete numbers on how much they spend on advertising, but the general rule of thumb is that a movie needs to make double its budget to break even, and anything over that is typically profit. So with that considered, let's see which phase had the most estimated profit compared to how much it cost to make. Phase 1 had a total budget of $1 billion, and it made $3.813 billion, which is 3.813 times its initial budget. Phase 2 had a total budget of $1.09 billion, and it made $5.27 billion, which is 4.834 times its initial budget. Phase 3 had a total budget of $2.3 billion, and it made $13.504 billion, which is 5.87 times its initial budget. Phase 4 had a total budget of $1.45 billion, and it made $5.825 billion, which is 4.01 times its initial budget. Even though we do have to consider that Disney doesn't get all of the profits from Spider-Man movies, nor do they pay all the budgeting costs. They produce roughly 25% of his movies and only get back 25% of the net profits. So when you reduce No Way Home's $1.91 billion by 75%, it really only made Disney about $477.5 million in total. And before 2019, Marvel got even less for Spider-Man solo films. But even when I reduce Homecoming and Far From Home's profit to zero, Phase 3 still made back 5.06 times its budget. While when I recalculate No Way Home's numbers with a fourth of the budget and a fourth of the profit in mind, Phase 4 really made 3.377 times its initial budget, which puts it in last place in terms of raw profit. So yeah, it's all about context. When you see these numbers go up and up and up each phase, and then the newest one suddenly drops to the bottom, yeah, that looks really bad. But technically, when we look at the numbers, it still made that cheddar cheese. It didn't break even, it didn't lose any money, so the cinematic side of Phase 4 was absolutely not a failure in that regard. Disappointing? Yes. Hollow? Reductive? Inconsistent? Shallow? Unfunny? Cheap? Disconnected? Moronic? Mind-numbingly stupid? Absolutely. But a failure, I'm not so sure. I think Phase 3 set such an unbelievable expectation that every movie had to hit close to $1 billion, and that's just unrealistic. After this huge culmination that had never been done before, Marvel came back down to earth a little bit, and I think these numbers are respectable, all things considered. Once again, I'm no fan of Phase 4, but they did also have to start all the way over and introduce completely new characters for us to get used to. You know, besides the copycats. And also, Disney Plus was a huge factor as well. Having a movie come out on D Plus a month after it hits theaters made some people say, I'll just wait until it's streaming and watch it then. There's no rush to see it if you get to watch it at home for no extra charge 29 days later. So that affected these products because it discourages box office growth and kills a lot of the initial hype and excitement. Yeah, this was the phase of gimmicks and mantle passing and nostalgia, but does that make it a failure? Maybe thematically and artistically, absolutely. I think anyone who has been following this franchise since 2008 can clearly see the major dip in quality. Rushed story arcs, dumb plot lines, boring villains, uninteresting leads, lazy diversity, terrible writing, horrendous CGI, no sense of direction. It's so easy to dunk all over this phase of Marvel. But even if I can prove how these movies are thematically inconsistent and poorly conceived, people are still going to see them. The question is, are they enjoying them? Well, let's find out. Now, I'm no fan of review websites. I literally couldn't care less about what Rotten Tomatoes says about a film because it means nothing. Other people's opinions have no correlation to my enjoyment of a movie. But critical and commercial consensus is really the only other way I can fairly compare all the phases of Marvel in a consistent and objective way. So I'm going to look at the IMDb and Metacritic score for each movie, then tally the average score for each phase like I did with the box office, so we can get an idea of the general reception each phase had. These are the main two websites I trust the most, even though a lot of people on both sides do sometimes bomb movies or unfairly praise them depending on whatever their agenda is that day. Someone might give a movie a 1 out of 10 because they don't like Brie Larson's face, or give it a 10 out of 10 because Marvel have cool action scenes or they're attracted to Tom Hiddleston. But in general, I think the scores even themselves out in the end. So, Phase 1 had 3 out of their 6 movies with a rating of 7 or better on IMDb, coming out to an average rating of 7.2 out of 10. And they had 1 movie with a 70 or better on Metacritic, coming out to a total average of 64.8 out of 100. Phase 2 had 5 out of 6 movies with a rating of 7 or better on IMDb, with an average of 7.4 out of 10. And 2 movies with a 70 or better on Metacritic, coming out to an average of 65.3 out of 100. Phase 3 had 10 out of their 11 films with a 7 or better on IMDb, coming out to an average of 7.6 out of 10, and 7 movies with a 70 or better on Metacritic, with an average of 72.5 out of 100. Phase 4 had 2 out of 6 movies with a 7 or better on IMDb, coming to an average of 6.9 out of 10, and 2 of them had a 70 or better on Metacritic, coming to a total average of 63.7 out of 100. So, as we can see, Phase 4 is dead last in review average with both critics and general audiences. And it's not even close with the general audience. If you have eyeballs, you can see that this was the most disliked phase in Marvel's history. And while some people aren't coming from a good and honest place when reviewing them, most of us were. We still watched the movies and shows and gave Disney money hoping that they would recapture the magic of past endeavors, but they never really did. And one by one, die-hard Marvel fans just started to not care anymore. Thousands of us who used to race to the theater and show up early on opening night so that we could be the first person to sit down in a chair and watch the next Marvel movie are now saying, I might go see it on Sunday or Monday, maybe Tuesday if I get around to it. I mean, they did produce some incredible comic book movies, so they can do it. They've shown us that they have the ability to do it. So it's kind of hard for me to give up on them when I know the potential. So if I have to sit through She-Hulk and Eternals and Love and Thunder to get a great Fantastic Four or Spider-Man movie, I'll do it. I'll trudge through the swamp of shit if it means we get one great movie per year, but we haven't been getting that. Their best movies have just been fun and pretty good. I don't think they've made a truly great film since Infinity War. Yes, No Way Home and Endgame were great experiences for my inner nerd, but I don't think they were great films. And if Quantumania is any indication of how Phase 5 is gonna go, holy fuck, we're doomed. So, in summation, after all this babbling, was Marvel Phase 4 a failure? Did we ever answer the question? Well, it depends on your point of view and what you deem as a failure. It had the 3rd worst average box office, the worst estimated return on investment, and the worst overall reviews of all the phases. So that's not exactly good. But if you're the worst performing phase in the most successful franchise of all time, is that truly a failure? Isn't that like being the worst tasting Mountain Dew flavor? It might not be code red, Red or Baja Blast, but it's still pretty decent. Are these movies really as bad as Fast and Furious or Space Jam or a Kevin James straight to Netflix movie? Or do they just look really bad compared to the greatness that has come before? Yeah, compared to Winter Soldier, Guardians 1, Iron Man, Infinity War, movies like Eternals and Love and Thunder are cinematic cancer. But as we saw, we still went to go see them for the most part. They still made money and the franchise is still going. Why is that? If we think the movies are lacking in quality, we have to speak with our wallets. And not as many people are doing that as we think. Marvel doesn't care about your 27-minute review of Ant-Man. They care about the $14 you spend on the movie ticket. And we can't just act like COVID didn't happen. The world fundamentally changed for 2 years. And that definitely had an impact on the box office of some of these movies. The news fearmongered people into not leaving their house. So some people didn't exactly want to go to a packed theater to see Marvel's next D-list hero make their cinematic debut. So what I'm basically saying is there are many factors that went into the negative embrace of Phase 4. I don't think it's a straightforward case of failure or success. And I'm really not trying to defend Disney here. I am no fan of theirs, and I only maybe enjoyed like 6 out of the 17 products they released in the past 2 years. Just take a look at my channel. I'm just trying to give an unbiased and truthful point of view so that we can dig through the bullshit and really determine the legitimacy of some of this narrative. In terms of money, Phase 4 did well for introducing multiple unknown characters and starting during a global pandemic. And if they took an already established character and made them quote-unquote woke, they didn't exactly go broke. In terms of quality, it was kind of ass. I think that we can all agree that even though it had some undeniable high points, the lows were lower than prior phases. If there was a shitty story arc like the fake Mandarin that pissed off fans, they would come back the next year with Guardians of the Galaxy and the Winter Soldier to make up for it. A palate cleanser of epic proportion. Now, if there is a shitty story arc, it's just followed by more piles of shit. It's easier to forgive the mistakes when every other project is good, and harder to forgive the mistakes when all of the projects are consistently subpar. So, do I think Phase 4 was a failure? Abso-fucking-lutely. An unmitigated disaster of lazy storytelling, unintelligent diversity inclusion, poor writing, unnecessary mental passing, below average visual effects, oversaturation, multiversal confusion, and a severe lack of understanding what makes these characters compelling. But the real question is, what do you think? Was Marvel Phase 4 a failure? Or is that an abstract concept that we can't factually quantify? Tell Daddy in the comments. And until we meet again, I love you. Peace out.